Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this first CEER webinar on dynamic regulation. I hope it will not be the last one on dynamic regulation, but we plan to organize a series of them when we will have more flesh to report on. My name is Nadia Hausmann. I am head of unit at the German regulator, responsible for the international work of the regulator, with international organizations, with European institutions, and I'm also the chair of the benchmarking task force at CEER. I am in charge with other colleagues of the topic dynamic regulation, with other colleagues at CEER, of course. And our intention today is to present to you the outcome of work that have been done within CEER, but also within the OECD, who has to present a very interesting document proposing recommendation on how to deal with agile regulation. So we will have today, a part of me, two speakers, one from CEER and one from the OECD. Our colleague from OECD, which is Miguel Amaral, is senior policy analyst. He has a PhD in economics from Panthéon-Sorbonne. Is deputy head of the OECD regulatory policy division and is leading the work on better regulation and innovation. The second speaker is a well-known one within CEER and in the regulatory work is Luca Lociavo, which is deputy director of the infrastructure regulation department at the Italian regulator ARERA, where he's working since 1997, and is member of the ACER task force on infrastructure and member of the CEER distribution system working group. So we have also present at this webinar, and I want to thank them already now, representative from the consultant CEPA, who assist and support actually CEER in developing this report on dynamic regulation, in the person of Ben Shafran and Hattie Slatter, who are here today. So I welcome them also, and I'm happy, even they are not going to participate actively, at least participate to the discussion and answer questions if there are some for them. Okay, after the presentation of today, we will have three presentations. There will be a Q&A session, and I would ask the participants to submit their questions via the questions chat, so that we can recap and compile them and discuss on this at the end of the three presentations. And please indicate also your name and the organization you are working for. Okay, so you can see now the agenda. I just made the opening remarks so that we can go now to the three presentations we have prepared for today's webinar and then the Q&A. So next slide, please. So I will be the one to begin and present the CEER report on dynamic regulation that have been published for some weeks now by CEER. Next slide. This report actually is, and perhaps just I would say a step back, just to explain why regulators and since when regulators are dealing with dynamic regulation topics or initiatives. You have to know that, of course, for us, regulation must be stable, but it cannot remain static. That's why, as from 2019, we had in our first CEER strategy, what we call the 3D strategy, 3 pillars in it that was related to digitalization, decarbonization, and the last pillar was actually dynamic regulation. At that time, to be honest, nobody had a clear clue where the journey will bring us. So we were clear that we will have to cope with innovation, but we didn't know at that time where and with which tool actually. So these 3 pillars are still relevant in the new strategy we have now for the next 4 years, which is the strategy empowering consumers for the energy transition. So that there is actually a very close link with the 2 strategies. At this moment in 2019, when we began to look at dynamic regulation tools and experiences, it was quite clear to us that we will have to link this dynamic regulation topic to decarbonization and digitalization. We will see now that we are going a little bit more further now when it comes to the aim of dynamic regulation, and we have more insight actually on what should dynamic regulation actually deliver. So if you look at our strategy, we still have dynamic regulation as one of the hot topic, I would say. And in this strategy, NRA is committed actually to empower consumer for the energy transition. So you can see that the core, or those who are at the core of the strategy are the consumers, enabling the energy system integration, integrating renewable, incentivizing innovation. So you have this element here in the strategy, and placing consumer at the center actually of the energy markets with what we call, and this is what the relevant element is in the strategy, a consumer-centric dynamic regulation. So it is a dynamic regulation which is not only looking at the experiences and the tool to put in place, but one of the main perspectives to tackle the issue is to look at how to involve consumers, how to get to take them on board in order to make them part of the market and to allow them to accept those trials and those new innovations. So actually, we need to trial innovative solutions. This is quite clear, and this must be based. And this is where I say we are looking a little bit more deeply the aim of the to be I would say coped with by dynamic regulation, which is integrate renewable energies, enhance energy efficiency, of course, enhance also decarbonization and digitalization. So those are the four main topics that we have in mind, and of course quality of the grid functioning. Those are the main topics that we put at the very front of what dynamic regulation should actually deal with. So the dynamic regulation concept is here actually to unlock what we call flexible solutions, while at the same time we should keep with well-proven fundamental regulatory principles, and at the core of this is of course the predictability. So to come back now to the report as such that we are presenting today, you could have seen, for those who have gone through it, and I hope most of you did today, because I'm not going to go through the report as such. It's a very broad and extensive overview of all the dynamic regulation tools and experiences that we have in the report. So what we have in mind is to follow up on what I said when delivering the CEER strategy, to go much more in what we have in place, and from that try to assess and compare the approaches that we have analyzed in the report, and try to propose good practices and recommendation when it comes to the role of the regulator. So in the report, you have a list of energy dynamic regulation approaches, projects, mainly in the EU, in order to increase the comparability. Also because the framework, legal framework is the same within the EU. But of course, we looked at other dynamic regulation experiences like in GB and Australia. In order to make this report, we had the help of an external consultant, CEER, which I wish to thank again for their excellent work that have been delivered. The idea was to have a consultant looking from another perspective at this topic, because we had already running within CEER in 2020, but it was more the perspective of the regulators looking at what regulators are doing. The perspective that was provided by CEPA is to have a broader view on the different experiences, and of course to come up with the kind of comparison between the models put in place. So if you look at the structure of the report, you have two main parts. The first one is the analysis of the regulatory approaches. taken by NRA, so that we really focus on experiences where regulators have been really heavily involved. And the second part is mainly looking at the case studies that have been submitted from EU countries. You have France, Ireland, Italy, Lithuania, Portugal, the Netherlands, and as I said, outside EU, GB, and European Union, sorry, GB and Australia. So you have a good, I would say, coverage of the experiences that are put forward and implemented in EU countries these days. What we try to do in this report is to define dynamic regulation, because we are all struggling with different words, with different concepts, and concepts which are in their nature, but also in their intention different. So that's why what we try to do, and I think we manage mostly to have a kind of set of, I would say, a definition, which is a regulatory approach that is limited in time. So you have, you need the regulator here to be active in either providing exemptions, for example. This approach must be limited in time. It must be focused on the energy sector activities it covers, or on the energy sector actors who can participate to the dynamic regulation. The aim, of course, is important. It should be to cope with some novelty, innovation in the energy systems, with the ultimate goal to inform future regulatory decision-making through experimentation. So the idea at the end of the day is to have a new legal framework that is coping with the challenges put forward with new novelties or innovation in the energy system. So we can go to the next slide. So that I would go directly to the set of recommendations that have been made in the report to the regulators, actually, because it is a report written for us, regulator, and to try to see where is our role and how to best interact with the stakeholder here. So very shortly, first set of recommendation, in order to, there is some common features that all the dynamic regulation initiatives must have to be successful. Of course, I was talking about the legal framework. It is key. If there is no legal rules allowing regulators to act or to interact, you cannot have dynamic regulation tools. You need clarity on the objective of the dynamic regulation initiative. This is what I mentioned earlier, whether it is integration of renewable, whether it is development of digitalization. The process for granting dynamic regulation and the approval criteria need to be well defined, mainly in very close cooperation with the stakeholders. NRAs must ensure that the initiative includes appropriate consumer protection, consumer rights, consumer information. As I said, the new strategy for CEER is putting the consumer at the core of the strategy, so that also the dynamic regulation tools and experiences have to take this into account. Clear and extensive communication and support. If you don't inform the stakeholders about these tools and about the tools that you put in place, of course, it will not be a success. So you have to inform extensively people to say which tool you are putting in place and what is the framework that you are proposing. Reporting, monitoring, evaluation are also key to addressed where necessary during the period of where the dynamic regulation is put in place, but also after, to have some lessons learned. And of course, sufficient resourcing of the NRA is key in order to have people which are within the NRAs allowed to assess properly the innovations and to trial the experiences put forward. Okay, next slide, very shortly. So the second set of recommendation, and that was the interesting thing for us as regulator when going through the different options, because we have a definition of dynamic regulation, but we have different options how to implement it actually. What we saw is that there is really different degree of NRA involvement. You have some NRAs who are leading the process, you have others that are facilitator, and you have others that are just observer of the dynamic regulation tools or experiences put in place. The aim is, of course, to promote innovation. I think this is quite clear, and to inform future regulatory reforms. The scope of the activity can be specific to very broad. Another point which is very important actually to put in place to have a proper implementation of dynamic regulation tools is to have clear views and provision on the funding to support the innovation, and of course to clarify which kind of participants are going to be involved here. Of course, the regulated entities, but also any market participant interested or new entrants. The next slide, please. Here you can have, and you have it also in the report, so that's why I will not go through in details, but the interesting thing here in this summary is that you can see, linked to the case studies we go through, what is the degree of NRA involvement, what is the role of the NRA, what is the scope of activity, the type of participant, and the funding. And if you are interested in having really two different approaches, you can look at the French and the Italian cases, because we have also today French and Italian representative who can answer your question if you have some. But you can see that you have two different processes where NRAs were facilitator for the French case, and for the Italian case where the regulator was driving the process. Okay, so next slide, and I will finish here because I am taking too much time. Yes. So when conducting this study, actually, we could see that many dynamic regulation initiatives had not led now to live project trials, so that we are too early actually in delivering this report. The evidence on the impact of dynamic regulation that we have so far in the report is mainly limited to the design, how it looks like, who is participating, NRAs, other entities, how are the stakeholders involved, the implementation, what is the process in place, is it transparent enough, are the tools put in place understandable for the stakeholders, and the DIA process, rather than the directly impacting on the energy consumers. So that would be, you can see, the next step of the report of CEER, to look at what we now have in place and have identified in this report, is that we will have to look at what are the lessons learned and what to improve those who are in place now. You can see here, and I'm not going to go into more details, but in the slide you can see what have been the lessons learned. I can take only the first bullet point. The Irish, Italian, Lithuanian cases found that there were a single entity, where a single entity plays a central role in enabling the dynamic regulation. It was better to have a, I would say, successful dynamic regulation experience. The main advantage, of course, observed is that there were more clarity on this responsibility and on who has the decision-making power. Clarity on who innovators need to approach also, and the ability to pursue a specific objective or agenda is also a point that have been highlighted, and of course a clear accountability. So this is really a very rapid, I would say, go through the report that we issued and published this year. I'm happy with the CEPA consultant to answer questions on that later on. And if there is no further main questions or remarks at this stage, I would be happy to give the floor directly to you, Miguel, and to take us through the OECD recommendation for what you call an agile regulatory governance. You can see that we have really different works. We are not only speaking about dynamic regulation, but agile regulation or adaptive regulation. And I'm happy that you present some recommendations that are made mainly to the governments, because you are an organization advising the governments, which is also interesting for us to hear, because this is from where it began actually, and you have more experience that regulator because you began very early, or I would say some years ago, to look at the dynamic regulation experiences. Thank you very much. The floor is yours, Miguel.
Thanks indeed, Nadia, and I'm indeed delighted to give you a flavor of the recommendation on agile regulation for innovation. So the key objective for you to have in mind is really to help government and to provide guidance, to help them kind of rethink policy making in the fourth industrial revolution, to both realize the benefits of innovation while at the same time, mitigating the risks. So the recommendation is basically organized around 4 main pillars. The first pillar is the need to adjust and adapt regulatory management tools, meaning regulatory impact assessment, stakeholder engagement, and ex post review. So the key here is really to incentivize government to develop more flexible, dynamic, iterative assessment cycle when it comes to regulatory impact assessment or ex post review, and really doing a constant monitoring and ex post evaluation of existing regulation, which is one of the drawbacks in most OECD countries. So, and somehow the unloved part of policy making across most OECD countries. So the second pillar of the recommendation is on the need to foster cooperation and joint up approaches, including across borders. So we know that, for example, a lot of different innovation, they don't respect, the administrative barriers within governments, and they don't respect as well, the national boundary. So it might raise a number of problems, either curbing innovation or failing to protect citizens or users against the potential adverse effect of innovation. So the recommendation is that really a key pillar is really firmly insisting on the need for government to coordinate better within governments, but also across boundaries, basically. And this is really, this is what we call basically international regulatory cooperation. So this is not necessarily about doing a treaty, but it could be also about fostering mutual learning, trying as far as possible to improve consistency, coherence between the different regulatory regime across countries, and where relevant, develop joint up approaches. And we do have in this area a really nice example, which is given by the creation of the so-called Agile Nations, which followed a joint event co-organized by the OECD and the World Economic Forum. And clearly the objective there is really to foster cooperation, mutual learning, sharing foresight, horizon scanning, and try to understand better, what are the regulatory approaches that might be promising, and what are regulatory approaches that might not be super well suited for all the different regulatory challenges raised by innovation. So just for you to flag the existence of this network to foster international regulatory cooperation when it comes to innovation. The third pillar is on the need to basically extend the regulatory toolbox of governments and regulators by including more agile approaches to regulation. So this is where the OECD recommendation is basically pointing to the need to create more space for experimentation. So for example, regulatory sandboxes, really to foster policy learning and adaptation of the existing regulatory framework. So I'm happy to come back to that after that, which is, as this is kind of one of the priority area of work of the OECD around the recommendation going forward. The second message under that third pillar is on the need to anticipate much more by means of horizon scanning, scenario planning, but also through a much more earlier engagement with the public, so not necessarily with the usual suspect, the key stakeholders, but with the broad public at large, basically. One is to one reason is to build decision making on the best evidence, basically. And second is to foster trust across the policy-making cycle. And trust is a problem nowadays across most of OECD countries. The third idea is on the need to develop what we call the soft law approaches to regulation. So self-regulation, co-regulation, industry standards, ethical business regulation, for example. because this is providing some flexibility in terms of in terms of regulatory approaches. So this is good for innovation, and it might be a nice complement to other kind of regulatory or existing regulatory approaches. So I'll come to that in a minute. And last but not least, under that pillar on the need to develop more agile approaches to regulation, the recommendation is insisting on the need for government to better harness, the opportunities provided by outcome-based approaches to regulation, not necessarily defaulting to rule-based approaches. And that's another key message of the recommendation. Even though this is not that easy to implement an outcome-based regulation, there is also the fact that the pure outcome-based regulation doesn't make any sense. Would always be a mix of, outcome provisions and rule-based provision, of course. But I mean, as far as it makes sense, as far as you government or regulator are able to monitor, to control the compliance with the outcome-based regime, then there might be a really nice option in the face of both the pacing problem, the need for flexibility for businesses, and maybe also the search for cost effectiveness for businesses. Under an outcome-based regime, this is up to the business to find the most effective way to comply with the outcome, and this is driving incentives. So that could be in a number of different respects. Outcome-based regulation could be a good approach. And last but not least, the recommendation under the last pillar is really trying to insist on the need to reconsider the traditional enforcement strategies, basically. So designing a regulation is one thing, being able to properly enforce the regulation is another one. And usually we feel like governments spend a lot of effort about doing regulatory impact assessment, doing stakeholder engagement, but far less in terms of rethinking a little bit what needs to be done in terms of enforcement to match the new reality we are facing, in particular given the pace and all the enforcement problems raised by innovation. If you think, for example, that liability issues raised by any kind of artificial intelligence. So two main ideas. One is the need to really promote outcome-based and risk-based approach to enforcement, not necessarily focusing on, doing an annual inspection because you have to do an annual inspection, even though there is absolutely no risk, very little risk, basically. So moving towards, risk-based approach to that. And the second is really to use all the opportunities provided by digital technologies, a data-driven approach to enforcement, to improve regulatory delivery. Couple of remarks in this area. We feel like for governments and regulators in particular, basically, digital technologies offer three main opportunities. One is it may enable regulators to monitor more closely regulated markets, building decisions on a more comprehensive knowledge, more accurate data, more on more precise data on the regulated environment. So that could really help also regulators to monitor what is going on markets. Second, of course, digital tools can really significantly improve supervision and inspections and enforcement activities via the collection of more granular data sets, and more again accurate data on what is going on regulated markets. So, and in turn, using data-driven approaches to streamline, to improve regulatory enforcement might also help streamline compliance processes for businesses and reduce significantly the associated regulatory burden. So we feel like this is really an interesting area for government to be considered, and regulators, of course. Last, and we have really I feel like we have a good practice with the French telecom regulators when it comes to data-driven approach, because they're using data information, to provide more information to consumers and in turn to help reduce the information asymmetry between the regulator and the regulated entity. So kind of move away from the standard traditional bilateral relationship between the regulators and the regulatee, and try to bring back the consumer in the middle of that equation, and create, by means of better information, create incentives to steer the market in the right direction. So as far as we understand, that practice is driving some interesting results in terms of quality, in terms of investment, so we feel like, this is something really interesting to be considered, and that's something we are looking at quite closely, and all the more since I've been a regulator for 10 years in the French Transport Authority. So this is really something that is quite close to my heart on a personal basis. So just a few words in terms of to conclude my speech here. One is we've tried to make quite clear in the recommendation that none of the so-called, agile approaches to regulation are without limitation or without flaws. Self-regulation, we make clear the fact that self-regulation will only work when there is a certain degree of alignment between the interest of the government / regulator and the regulated entity. If not, well, there is a lot of chances that self-regulation will lead to quite bad outcomes, basically. And by the way, there is a need when you go for self-regulation to be able, via data collection, to make sure that self-regulation is going towards the right outcomes. Same for outcome-based regulation. Maybe can lead to a lot of regulatory uncertainties for small businesses in particular, as regard how to comply with an outcome-based regime. So there's a lot of academic literature on that, showing that this is not a magical solution. This is not necessarily a first best. So in some cases, to reduce these regulatory uncertainties, might be a need to combine this with kind of soft law instruments, like regulatory guidance, for example, and to do a mix of regulatory approaches to help, reduce the level of regulatory uncertainties, which can be detrimental to innovation, basically. Same for regulatory sandboxes. This is a new trendy regulatory approach. Basically, we are doing a lot of work on that, so I won't spend a lot of time on that, but basically it can raise clear competition concerns. So, and this must be considered by governments when they think about regulatory sandboxes, just to avoid picking winners to the regulatory sandbox, and make sure that they are maintaining a level playing field while they are developing some kind of regulatory exemptions, for example. So that's absolutely key. So considering the potential limitation and finding ways to address them is absolutely key when thinking about, agile approaches to regulation. Second key message, which gonna resonate with the first presentation, is really that need to move away from that idea that regulation should be static. So we feel like all of these different approaches should be implemented in a dynamic perspective, given the pace of technological development, basically. And as an example, regulatory sandboxes might be well suited at the early stage of the technological development, to build evidence, to foster adaptation, to foster policy learning as regards technological development. But as the technology develops, there is really that need to maybe move towards other regulatory regime, and this is something that should be anticipated as the work on the regulatory sandbox starts, basically. And to conclude, I'd like to say that, well, a key precondition for the implementation of all the different principles given by the recommendation is to build appropriate capacity within governments and regulators. So this is key to understand regulatory gaps and challenges. This is key to design the appropriate regulatory or non-regulatory approach. This is key to enforce the regulation. This is key also to monitor existing regulation and see whether they are driving effectiveness or not, basically. In that case, we might have a need to rethink the existing regulation. So in that perspective, I think there is two main levers. One is to reskill the workforce when appropriate, when needed, if as far as possible. Of course, we all know that regulators and governments are facing budget constraints, but well, might be a need to think about that going forward, really, to be able to implement agile approaches. But this is also about, reconsidering and rethinking, the existing governance frameworks and adapt where relevant the mandates and powers of government and regulatory agencies. That's absolutely key. So we can't take it for granted and build everything on the assumption that the institutional setup is fit for purpose, given the challenges raised by innovation. So that's my key conclusion. And you'll see, and I hope that I've provide some incentives for you to look carefully to the recommendation. But we feel that when it comes to better regulation and innovation, clearly regulators, economic regulators, are in a unique position because they really have their fingers on the pulse of markets, and this should be really capitalized upon by government, to understand the risk and opportunities raised by innovation, but also to help government, build the appropriate regulatory approach, regulatory and non-regulatory approach, depending on the case, of course. So, and we feel like there is certainly a lot of avenues to better harness the technical expertise of economic regulators within that recommendation, and give them a more prominent role when it comes to, in this regulatory ecosystem, when it comes to, defining the right regulatory strategy for any kind of new innovation. So, so that's it for me. I'll be happy to take any question going forward. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Miguel. A very extensive presentation, which make really the link between what regulators do or are supposed to do and how the support of the government is very important here to allow that. Okay, I see that there is no particular questions addressed to you so far, Miguel, so I would propose to go directly to the next presentation, as we are a little bit behind in terms of schedule. So I would ask Luca to come in and provide us an overview of the second, actually, I would say, dynamic regulation related paper that have been published this year by CEER, which is focusing on regulatory sandboxes in incentive regulation. So a very particular topic that we have gone through. Luca, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Luca, we cannot hear you, unfortunately.
Sorry. Thank you. Thank you very much. I start from this consideration. There are a lot of different approaches that regulatory authorities in energy have implemented. This is only a picture of many names. We don't still have a common language, but there is at least a common aspect. That is learning process. Learning process is the common idea of so many different tools that have been experimented. In such a situation, the CEER Distribution System Working Group paper report, the objective was to provide clarity and guidance. Clarity in order to understand the different approaches, and guidance with recommendation to NRAs in order to mainly facilitate innovation without compromising, of course, the effectiveness of incentive regulation. I want only to say that not only regulators are involved in this topic. I know that among the people attending today, there are many colleagues from ISGAN. I want to thank them very much for the huge work that ISGAN has made during the last years about this topic. And I want to quote this short policy message paper from ISGAN that states, yes, of course, rigid regulatory systems are a problem. They can really be a barrier for instance, smart grid deployment, but there is not only that. There are many other barriers. This is about especially upscaling, so rollout of first well-tried solutions. And so we must consider that regulators are a part of the system. They are not the system. So the reason why NRA should facilitate innovation are very clear nowadays. I want only, they've been also stated in the previous talks. I remind energy system transformation, because the new system requires a more flexible regulation, more dynamic, more agile, as the OECD colleagues say in regulation. There is also an important role of grid operators towards neutral market facilitators and innovation enablers, thanks especially to the digitalization. And therefore, NRA roles is to help such evolution of grid operators, to support, to foster such evolution. And we are also absolutely conscious that regulation affects incentives to innovate. In the paper, we discussed shortly, for instance, input versus output-based regulation, or different or equal treatment between OPEX and CAPEX. There are many topics in regulation that affects capability to innovate. We also, as it has been said, surveyed the situation among NRAs, and more or less half of European NRAs do have some regulatory approach to innovation, let's say Sandbox within commas, and even more are considering their implementation. We started from a definition of Sandbox, as it has been given by the Financial Conduct Authority in GB, that is a safe space where business can test products and services and so on. This idea of Sandbox is very important for innovation, of course, but our questionnaire shows that there is a large variety of approach, as I reminded in my first slide. And so we try to understand which are the main characteristics of each approach. And we found 4 main dimensions. One is the type of actors involved. Network regulated entities like DSOs and TSOs, or also, let's say, liberalized activity operators like suppliers, aggregators, generation, and so on. The second dimension is who is the lead? Who has the lead of the innovation experimentation? This was also a consideration made by the CEER consultant. And here we divide policy-driven or demand-driven approaches. A third dimension is the scale of implementation. There is a large variety. There are some cases where the dimension is relatively small and typically pilots, and other cases where the dimension is rather big, rather large. And finally, which is the process adopted in allowing such sandboxes or pilots, especially, is there any approval process, or is there a ex-ante general framework? This is another big differences. So if these are the 4 main categories that differentiate approaches among European regulators, we also found 3 main commonalities of these approaches. And these commonalities are well reflected in the definition given by the first paper presented by Nadia. One is the limited duration. The approach to innovation is typically limited in time, and if there is a success, something should happen and the innovation should be transferred under, let's say, normal, ordinary regulation. So the idea that the approach to innovation covers a phase in the regulation development. The second is, as I said in the beginning, orientation to learning. And here many topics are relevant because learning is immaterial and covers dimensions like transparency, discussion, frank feedback, as option says, evaluation of cases, dialogue with other institutions, research bodies, and so on. And the third important, extremely relevant topic are derogations. Derogation can have different forms. They are very frequent in, let's say, sandbox approaches. But there is a but, that case-by-case derogation embed the risk of discrimination. And this is a point to which regulators have to be extremely careful, In the paper, we also quote an important public document from the European Council stating that a high level of protection of citizens, consumers, employees, and so on has to be ensured, and existing levels of protection need to be respected, even in derogations. The paper also touches some institutional consideration, among which the governance of regulatory sandbox approach can vary. This has been also a topic treated by the paper made by SIPA consultant. Sometimes the responsibility is with the government, sometimes with an array, sometimes combined. The source of legal powers is not common. There is not a common frame around Europe. There are some countries where existing regulatory powers are enough to start and govern sandbox approaches, in others not yet. An important topic about derogation is that rarely derogation involves only regulation. Sometimes derogation could involve other type of norms that are out of the jurisdiction, for instance, of regulators. And this means that we need an important level of cooperation among different institutions related to the power system, ultimately. I conclude saying that probably the most interesting point of the paper is what we call innovation toolkit. And to explicit what we mean for toolkit, I recover the idea of dimension. The first dimension is the scale of the innovation. And although this is, of course, not let's say, fully quantitative approach, we can differentiate between small and large. Of course, here common sense helps. In a small state, a large scale could be small in respect for a large state. But however, we can consider typically small and large innovation as for scale. And the other dimension is who the kind of actors involved in the innovation, and at least we can divide two different groups. One is with grid operators only, and the other is where grid operators and market players are jointly involved. If we consider a matrix two per two dimensions of these two scales, we can fill the toolkit with four cases. The regulatory sandboxes are typically on a small scale, but with large participation. At the opposite, I would say, this is a name used in a few countries, among which Italy. Regulatory experiments are, on the contrary, operated on a large scale. Just to say, in Italy, the regulatory experiment is covering around 1/3 of the total customer basis in Italy, and this is especially focused in southern regions where we have some problems of infrastructures. But in this approach, only grid operators are involved. On the other side, if we look at This was typically in the past, I would say. Small-scale innovation with grid operators only were called pilot projects. And nowadays, there are a few cases with, with what we call pilot regulations. Pilot regulations are ex-ante framework, where there is no longer need for approval on a case-by-case, a sort of derogation implied in the temporary scheme that has been implemented in order to check the novelty. Well, if we consider the dimension policy-led versus demand-led, we see it in this axis. The regulatory sandboxes are the more demand-led tool in this toolkit. On the other way, on the other opposite, regulatory experiments are the more policy-led. And the fourth dimension is about the approach. Case by case is typical of pilot project, but also of regulatory sandboxes. The ex-ante frame is only with pilot regulation and somehow with regulatory experiments. These are, of course, a very synthetic consideration, but in the paper you can find more. I conclude, this is my last slide. The final recommendation of our paper. First, absolutely, NRA should engage in removing barriers, but without compromising with other important regulatory principles, among which efficiency. There is not a single approach. There is not a single approach. We normally use the wording regulatory sandboxes, but sandboxes are only one type of approach, regulatory approach to innovation. We think, as CEER Distribution System Working Group, that is extremely relevant that NRA must distinguish regulated activities from market activities, especially when coping with innovation. And as a consequence, when granting derogation, we must be sure to avoid any foreclosure of competition in market activities. This is why we should focus on the distinction between grid activities and market activities. Finally, I say, remember that all the effort for supporting innovation has one specific target: learning. Learning of all involved parties, and I conclude, regulators included. Regulators have to learn. We are here to learn together with the operators and the customers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luca. Thank you very much to you, Miguel, also. I think we have a very good overview now on what OECD put forward in terms of recommendation for NRAs. And I think we had really, came in the topic as such in your presentation, Luca, by giving an overview of how, particularly when it comes to incentive regulation, sandbox regulation can be a helpful element to cope with innovation. I look in the chat whether there are questions. There are some questions. I think there is one question which was mentioning the difference between dynamic regulation and regulated sandboxes. I assume that your presentation, Luca, already answered very good this question, because you have an excellent slide with a table in it, which is giving I would say, a good overview of the multiple tools which are available to NRA. So I assume that's okay. The other question is, does dynamic regulation require the implementation of the 2019 electricity directive, which has not been done by most of the member states? I think the question is the other way around, if I understand it good, meaning that whether there is the potentiality, for, whether dynamic regulation is foreseen in the electricity directive, is actually could be a legal basis for developing dynamic regulation. Do you want to say some word, Luca or Miguel? Perhaps Luca. Of course, also Ben, if you went through this topic.
Well, about the directive, I would say that, of course, it must be implemented. I don't consider exactly a condition the implementation of directive for innovation approach of regulators. For instance, in Italy, we started much in advance in respect of the new directive, started around 10 years ago. What is important is that the new directive requires an important change in the system and therefore in the regulation. And so innovation approaches can be useful to not to implement the directive, but to implement the regulation according to the new directive. And that is the real challenge for us in the next years.
Yeah, do you want to add something, Miguel, or Ben, Hattie? No? No, okay. What I could add perhaps on this topic is that clearly in the directive there is no mention of dynamic regulation or dynamic regulation tools. But what we have in the directive is definitely the call for integration of renewable, the call for innovation, and the call for flexibility. So if you take these elements, actually you could consider that the role, the duties, and the task of the regulators is to implement those principles, those goals. And then, of course, the question is, do you have the instrument for this? This is another question, but definitely a clear, I would say, legal framework for this. You cannot find it in the directive. What you will have in the future. Perhaps some of you already had the opportunity to look at the communication, Repower EU communication. There will be a guidance from the Commission that will be put forward by them to provide some criteria on sandbox regulation. So there will be from the European Commission some guidance to be provided for NRAs on how to best implement sandbox regulation. So that would be a beginning. It's not a legal act, it's only a guidance, but that would help indeed to implement the goals that are foreseen in the directive. Okay, another question is, let me check. Does dynamic regulation, this one we have it, could or would dynamic regulation be like in the regulation of hydrogen network operators? Or the question could be, is hydrogen or the integration of hydrogen, which is the wish of the EU lawmakers and a lot of member states, a goal or a sector that could be developed through dynamic regulation? Yes, certainly. In Germany, we have already this kind of dynamic regulation for hydrogen. In the law implemented, where we said there is a legal framework put in place. It is up to you as hydrogen operator to follow the rules or to be outside the rules if you consider that they are too, I would say, a burden for the development of your business. So indeed, it is the case in Germany. It will be potentially the case elsewhere. This is under review, but that's typically a sector where you can rely on dynamic regulation. Of course, there will be now in the gas decarbonization package, which is under review, there will be clear provisions when it comes to the regulation of hydrogen, so that it is in a way limiting the flexibility that some member states already have. But definitely, this is typically a sector that could, well, put forward more dynamic regulation tools.
Nadia,
yes, please.
Also, yeah. In Italy, we are moving towards the issue of innovation in pipelines, let's say, and in the next weeks is expected to be published a final decision after a wide consultation, 2 rounds of public consultation, exactly on this topic, how to innovate gas networks in order to go towards decarbonization, green gases, and ultimately hydrogen. So this is a very hot topic. We didn't use any extra power for such a topic because it's still under our gas, let's say, gas jurisdiction or energy integrated jurisdiction. and it's very relevant for the future, of course.
Okay, thank you. I see there is very we have to hurry up a little bit because we are behind. There is a question for you, Miguel. When you mentioned reconsidering enforcement strategies, do you also mean different ways of monitoring, like desk-based risk assessment with less light touch regulation in fewer, more serious cases? It's a long question. Can you answer in 2 sentences? 2 sentences. We can hear you, Miguel. No, we cannot hear you. Okay, let's go perhaps to the next question. Do you think there is a need for EU common governance towards dynamic regulation to cope with incoming challenges, or is it fine to leave different approaches in different countries? I think we more or less answered this in the way that if the Commission is going to propose guidance for member states and for NRAs, it means that there is a need to have, I would say, a basic set of rules that all the member states and all the NRAs should follow. So there is a need, definitely, to have a clear view of what are we talking about. The question shows also that that we don't exactly know now what is the reality covered by dynamic regulation. So that only for this, I think it's good to have an overview on what we are talking about and to have, I would say, an EU guidance to help us as regulator to come up with new solution and to support innovation. I think, Miguel, if you cannot answer the question, that's not a big issue because I'm ready.
I've been able to reactivate the microphone.
Yeah, okay. So if you can do it very shortly, and then I shall recap and terminate the webinar.
No, sure. No, I think what we were saying indeed is more on the use of new digital technologies to rethink enforcement activities using, for example, real-time monitoring. That's some kind of desk research, if you like, basically that does not rely on inside prisons to kind of do the compliance activity. But this is really about rethinking what could be done in terms of and what are the opportunities given by new digital technologies in this area. Just a quick word on regulatory sandbox, really super quick. We can fully agree, again, it's going to be a priority area of work of the OECD going forward as regards implementation. So we really completely agree on the fact that there is a strong need to better define the concept of regulatory sandbox. There is really different shades of sandboxing across countries. And well, a regulatory sandbox does not mean the same thing across countries. Second, we do really feel that well, regulatory experimentation is going well beyond regulatory sandbox. It could be a new approach to regulating, testing a new approach with a specific group of regulators, basically. But it can also be a new regulatory process, for example, when you think about, co-designing a regulation. So third, we feel like, regulatory experimentation is going also well beyond just releasing some constraints, some regulatory constraints to promote innovation. This is really also about, generating evidence in a complex and fast-changing environment, so to foster policy learning. So building the evidence with these fast developing technologies is absolutely key, to build consensus, to foster trust in the regulatory systems, and we feel like regulatory sandbox or experimentation could be a nice way to do that. But this is raising a lot of challenge, including on developing the right regulatory culture within governments. How do we manage failure? Failure could be a good result in terms of regulatory sandbox experimentation, but we don't like failure usually. So there is a need to rethink a little bit the governance and culture within government and regulators going forward to make successful regulatory experiments.
Okay, thank you very much, Miguel. Thank you, Luca. Nobody else want to intervene on this? If not, I'm going to conclude very shortly. Thank you very much to our speakers today for their presentation. Thank you very much to the participants and to the questions. The discussion is now beginning. We are now really opening the floor to you to react also. We are not, this webinar was really the opportunity for us to give a signal that we are as regulator now heavily dealing with dynamic regulation and all the tools that are put in place. So we invite you to provide any comments, feedback, questions under the CEER folder that we put in place on the CEER website. We have a dedicated link actually where we put there all the papers, all the information we have on dynamic regulation. And of course, we are happy if you use this platform, and you will have an email address there that you can contact if you have any kind of question on the document we have issued this year, and those who are upcoming, because the work is not finalized at CEER. We are now really tackling the issue. So thank you very much, Miguel, for saying that we need regulators need more space. To you, Luca, for saying that regulators need a safe place. I think we get a lot of more clarity on the flexible, adaptive, agile, dynamic regulation. So different words, one reality. Thank you for your presence today, and happy to follow up and discuss further with you. Thank you and bye-bye.